Welcome to the Cambridge Financial Podcast with Bert Salazar, CEO at Cambridge Financial Partners, LLC. This podcast is all about tax-preferred retirement planning, economics, financial risk management, and achieving a risk-free and successful financial life. Now, your host, Bert Salazar. Bert Salazar. Bert Salazar.
Hey, good day, everyone. Welcome to another Cambridge podcast. As always, I'm excited to be here with all of you today and hoping that I can bring some additional value to the table, as we always try to do every single week and every single podcast that we do for each and every one of you. I'm very excited because over the last 2 weeks we held some seminars at Nova Southeastern University and FIU, Florida International University, up in Broward County, in which obviously the seminar was on how to maximize your retirement planning and how to prepare, for retirement distribution planning. So these are great events that we host throughout the community, and we do it on behalf of SOFA, which is a Society for Financial Awareness, which is a 501c3 corporation nonprofit organization that their number one goal is to eradicate financial illiteracy in the United States. So our financial literacy program is very well received and very well taken by all attendees. So I'm excited to be part of that and to be part of SOFA and to continue to bring value to the South Florida marketplace and to educate employees and employers alike in how to really maximize retirement distribution planning at some point in time in the future. So today I want to touch bases with what I consider to be the 4 pillars of retirement. And we've talked about some of these things in the past, but I think it's important to bring it back to the forefront because it is apropos as we're approaching the end of tax season, which obviously it makes me very busy as well. But I want to talk to all of you about the 4 pillars of retirement, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to be able to do that, so I'm going to fly through this information. But as always, if you need to get a hold of you, most of you know how to get a hold of me. My telephone number is area code 786-766-1042. And you can also reach out to me at Bert, B-E-R-T, at GablesTaxGroup.com, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions, or if you need additional information, feel free to do so. So point number 1 is, the importance of addressing retirement through a risk management alternative. Most of the audits and most of the planning that we do for clients throughout Florida and the United States, because we do have clients all throughout the United States, are primarily, when we do an audit, is geared to find out what it is that the clients have done up until the point that they have come to visit with us. And notably, what we do have a tendency to find is that people are doing a lot of their planning through a microscope as opposed to a telescope. And when you make financial decisions through a microscope, you're not truly able to find out whether the impact of those decisions are positive or negative on the other side of the ledger. Because when you look at your finances through a microscope, you're basically looking at one decision at a time, and you're not looking at anything else. The way that we try to approach, and that all of you should try to approach your retirement planning, is to look at your finances not only through a microscope, but also through a telescope. Because when you do look at your financial decisions through a telescope, you will find a world and a view that you had never seen before, because you're going to be able to gauge and measure the impact of those decisions not only on one side of the ledger but also on the other. The other thing that is critical to understand is that it is very, very important to adhere to and understand the old paradigm of retirement versus a new paradigm. In the old ways, people used to work for the same company for 25, 30 years. They would retire with a pension. and they would pretty much just retire, and basically after a while they were going to live primarily under Social Security benefits or any other type of benefit that they may have, but they were going to be primarily spending time looking at their pensions, and they were going to use investments, a few investments here and there, just to be able to satisfy some of the other expenditures that they would find in retirement. These people in the old paradigm would just retire and not go back to work or not even work part-time because their income was sufficient to mitigate their retirement risk. And obviously because they retired many years ago, people were not living that longer then, so therefore they didn't have to plan for more than a 7 to 10 year period in retirement. Now today the world is totally different. Today, the new paradigm basically says that most Americans are going to work for, 6 to 7 companies in their lifetime. Many of them actually, many more companies. So, some people work for 10, 15 different companies within a 30 to 40 year. The other thing that is very prevalent and very critical is that in the old days, when you retire, you had a pension because you worked for the same employer for a long time, and then that employer would provide pension benefits. Well, after about 1980, most financial companies or most companies in the United States started shifting away from providing pensions to providing 401ks. And the reason for that was very important because by eliminating their pension benefits, then they would also be reducing their liability in retirement to all of their employees. So this way, they would provide you with a 401k or any other type of plan. They would do a match. Most of the companies would do a match. But now the responsibility, whether there was going to be enough money at time of retirement to maintain your standard of living, now went from the employer to the employee. So if you were an employee in one of those companies, now you needed to, become a money manager, understand, strategically how much money you need to set aside for how long, and to hopefully, although hope is not a financial strategy, to have enough money at some point in time in the future in order to meet all of your standards of living in retirement. So obviously that's a new paradigm. And then obviously now the 401ks and the IRAs have become the most prevalent aspect of retirement distribution planning. The other major factor is that people are living a lot longer today than ever before. So in the old days, people would only live for 7 to 10 days after retirement, some even less than that. But nowadays, you can spend 3 decades in retirement. So if you retire at age 65, you have to be able to plan for 3 decades. And we call those decades, and I'll mention a little bit about this later on, the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. So obviously, having the ability to manage risk in retirement is going to be apropos for all of you listening to this podcast. Now, the number one risk that I think is critical for all of us to be able to protect against is the risk of dying too soon. And there, I think what's important to note is, what is the impact to your family income and well-being if you happen to be married and one of you were to have a sudden or a premature death? What would be the impact to a pension? What would be the impact to your Social Security benefits? What would be the impact to asset and income replacement? And what would be the impact of the increases in taxation? So, for instance, if you work for an employer that provide a pension benefit, what kind of pension option did you choose at time of retirement? Did you choose one that would provide a surviving benefit to your surviving spouse? Or did you choose one that would give you the most amount of money, but if you had a premature death, the pension would also die with you? Now, the decision-making process for that is extremely important because if you don't do it the right way, number one, you may be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars on the table. But number two, and most important, is that you may very well be disinheriting your family without even knowing about it. Social Security benefits if you have a premature death. Well, the surviving spouse will immediately take up the highest Social Security benefit in the family. In this case, if one of the spouses has a higher Social Security benefit, the surviving spouse can legally opt in and take over that higher Social Security benefit. But by doing so, one of the Social Security benefits is going to go away. So what type of Social Security replacement planning has been done for the family? And most of the time, as we do audits, we find that very few times is any type of planning done in order to replace that lost income in retirement. And this applies as well to asset and income replacement. See, when you get to retirement, it's not so much money about the value of the assets that you have, but what is the cash flow and the income that you can generate out of each and every one of those assets. And then last but not least is what kind of planning have you done if there's a premature death as far as the doubling of taxes or the increase in taxes. You see, if you're married filing jointly in 2019, obviously I believe the standard deduction for this year will be $24,400. Well, if one of the members in the family were to pass away, except if they died during the year, then you can file as a widower and still benefit. But moving forward into the following years, now you just lost that standard deduction for married filing jointly, and you would go back down to the single deduction, which would give you less benefits than the doubling of the deduction under the married filing jointly. So again, most of the clients that we engage for the first time have never taken into consideration that if they have, qualified plan monies like 401ks and IRAs, it may actually cost them more money at time of retirement distribution if one of the spouses has prematurely passed away. So obviously the importance of managing that risk of dying too soon is quite impressive from a business perspective. Now, the next risk that again has nothing to do with dying too soon, but it has to do with living too long. Americans are living a lot longer again, as I explained a few minutes ago. They're living a lot longer today than they ever did before. As a matter of fact, longevity planning, it's a new phenomenon in the United States and throughout the world because people didn't used to live this long. Now, if you retire at the age of 65, you may very well be living in retirement for 3 decades. As a matter of fact, one of the fastest growing generations in the U.S. are people that are between the ages of 85 and 105 years of age. Now, what are some of the issues that you need to pay attention to in retirement and when living a long life? Well, number one, running out of money before you run out of life. For many Americans, running out of money is going to be a very important issue to deal with because if getting old is bad, getting old and having no money is even worse. The other issue, number 2, would be the inability to spend down principal due to improper and or lack of distribution planning. See, most of the clients that we engage and most of the audits and that we do on behalf of new clients, we have a tendency to find out that because of improper planning, clients are never going to be able to invade, or retirees are never going to be able to invade principal. They're going to be living off the interest because if they start to invade principal and they die several years later, there may not be any money left for the surviving spouse. So in many different ways, because of lack of planning, they have had no choice to live in an interest rate environment, and that interest rate environment does not look very good because of the fact that interest rates have been suppressed for the last 10 to 12 years. So if you have $1 million portfolio in a CD and is now parked earning 2%, that $1 million portfolio is worthless, because the only thing that it can do for you is to provide $20,000 of annual income or annual cash flow, which will also be taxable. So it's not really that much to live on. So those are things that are really important to note as you start to thinking about retirement distribution planning. Number 3 would be, planning for the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. And that's the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago. The go-go years is when you first retired. So usually between the ages of 65 and 75, depending on your health, obviously, and that of your spouse, if you're married. You're going to try to do things that you've never done before. You've been working all your life. You've been putting money away. You deserve to enjoy your life. So the first 10 years in retirement, you may actually be spending as much money in retirement as you did prior to retirement, because now you're going to be having a good time, and you're going to be traveling, and you're going to take trips and cruises and so forth. So it's going to be a go-go year type life. Now, once you get into your mid-70s, to your mid-80s, between 75 and 85, your health may not be as good. You may not be traveling as much. You may be staying closer to home so that you can spend more time with your family and grandchildren. So you're going from the go-go years to the slow-go years. You're still active, but not as actively involved as you were in your go-go years. And then last but not least, once you get into the mid-80s, until that point in time where you pass on, then obviously you're going to go into the no-go years. Your health is not going to be the same way that it had been for the previous 20 years. You may have had some health issues, some long-term care issues. You're doing very little traveling. Your number one goal from a business perspective and personal perspective would be to be able to wake up on the green side of the grass. So I think the big question is, well, what would be some of the risk planning options that you can put together for yourself and your family in order to protect against the risk of living too long? Number 1, you may want to start thinking about creating guaranteed look-alike pensions, and you do have the ability to do that, and there are different ways that you're able to create a pension, like if you had a pension from your employer and or similar to a Social Security benefit. So that way you can make certain that you're not going to run out of money before you run out of life, because that pension or that look-alike pension benefit would be guaranteed until the day you die. You can also have the ability to create spend-down straddles. So you have the ability through, again, pension and income replacement planning to set up straddles of different products and services that would allow you not only to be able to spend your interest, but also to be able to spend your principal without having to disinherit your family in retirement. So now you get to enjoy the best of both worlds, because now you can increase your standard of living because of the fact that you are also able to invade and spend principal while you're in retirement without having the risk of running out of money before you run out of life. And if you live a long life and then you die, then at least your spouse is going to be well protected, and he or she is not going to run out of income before he or she runs out of life as well. Another major risk, another pillar of retirement, that would be number 3 in our case, would be the risk of living with a disability, and that's a prevalent one. And the reason why it is a prevalent one is that people are living, again, a lot longer today than ever before. But because of the fact that people are living a lot longer today, there's a much higher susceptibility to having disabilities in retirement. As a matter of fact, statistically speaking, if you're a husband and wife and you're both age 65 and both of you are fairly healthy, there's a 75% probability that one of you is going to have a need for long-term care at some point in time in the future. And so obviously you need to be able to plan for that. So if living long is good, eventually you may have a need for long-term care, and there are different ways for long-term care that can hit you from a medical invasive and medical perspective that you need to be aware of. What are some of the things that you need to pay attention to when it comes to managing the risk of living with a disability? Well, number 1, the cost of long-term care. It's actually increasing at 3 times the rate of inflation. I know in Florida, for instance, the average cost of a nursing facility is somewhere around $92,000 a year. For many of you, the cost of long-term care, and that's today, by the way. I'm not talking about 10, 15, 20, 25 years down the line. I'm talking about today. Is anywhere between $6,500 and $7,500 a month of additional cost on top of maintaining your traditional standard of living. The other question, number 2, would be who's going to provide the long-term care? Many a times, if you're dealing again with a husband and wife, and one of them becomes disabled, the spouse that is not disabled pretty much has to freeze their lives and the enjoyment of their lives in order to provide the care for that person that they love so much and care for. So obviously providing for long-term care is very critical. Many times it's going to be your spouse, if you happen to be married. Many times it could be your children. What if you happen to be single? Are your children going to be able to provide that care? Would you want your children to provide that care for you, or do you want to be self-insured and fully protected from that perspective? Also, there's a fallacy where people think, Americans feel, that if they have a need for long-term care, that Medicare is going to be able to cover that cost, and Medicare does not, and I repeat, does not cover the cost of long-term care. So it is very important that as you start to assess your retirement situation, make certain that you look at all your retirement issues and concerns through a risk management perspective as opposed to the way that most Americans are doing it. Because if you're able to protect against these 4 major risks that I'm discussing with you today, then your life and your retirement life is going to be a lot more excited, and there's going to be a lot of excitement in your life than if you don't protect that accordingly. Also be aware that Medicaid spend-down rules will pretty much force you to go bankrupt and have no money left whatsoever and go broke before the Medicaid rules can actually engage. And if you have assets, the Medicaid rules now have a 5-year look back, so any assets that were transferred out of your estate in order to qualify for Medicaid, if you did so within a 5-year period between the time that you got rid of those assets and the time that you became disabled, they're going to have to be brought back into your estate and used first in order to provide that additional cost and care for you. By the same token, under the Medicaid spend-down rules, there's something called a minimum maintenance needs allowance, which pretty much says that if you have to go into Medicaid in order to provide long-term care for one of the spouses, the surviving spouse is going to be disinherited because every single asset is going to be used to provide for long-term care benefits. So that surviving spouse or that spouse that is not sick, that was hoping to have an exciting retirement, may never be there at all. Now, obviously, because of the minimum maintenance needs allowances rules, the spouse would be able to keep around one house, one car, $2,400 in a bank account, $2,500 of income. But is that going to be enough? It's not even enough today in 2019, let alone 10, 15, 20 years down the line, based on inflation rates in the United States of America. So the big question for all of you is, what are some of the risk planning options that you can take or that you can explore when it comes to the risk of living with a disability? Well, there are many ways to protect against the risk of living with a disability and or long-term care. You can self-insure it. So if you have a lot of money and you want to take the risk and self-insure, you can do so. Obviously, if you have a long-term care need like Alzheimer's, where you can spend 8 to 10 years in a nursing facility, what impact is that going to do on your assets, and are you going to have enough assets to make certain that it's going to cover all of those expenses, and then upon your death it's going to continue to provide those retirement benefits to your surviving spouse without having to disinherit them from a business standpoint. The other thing that you can also do is can your children provide the care? And will they want to provide the care? And then will that be something that you would want to bother your kids with? I know in my situation with my wife, I would never want my kids to take care of my wife and I, because, that would mean that their personal lives are going to be mitigated in a very negative way in order to provide the care to their parents, although they may very well want to do it. But why would you want to put your children through that endeavor? Anyways, you can also purchase long-term care coverage insurance, and you can do that. The challenge with long-term care insurance today is that most of the time it's not guaranteed, so prices can go up, and because it is a new phenomenon, insurance companies are still trying to figure out, how to price it properly. So that's an issue. The other issue is, what if you never need long-term care? What if you die in your sleep at the age of 90 and you bought a long-term care policy at the age of 60? So for 30 years you were paying premium for a contract that you were never going to use. And it's not only the fact that you lost that premium, but also the opportunity cost. What you could have done with that premium. Had you known that you were going to die in your sleep and without any need for long-term care, perhaps you could have taken that premium, and then you could have invested somewhere and get an internal rate of return on that investment to maximize your retirement distribution planning throughout your go-go years, your slow-go years, and your no-go years. So many a times, it's you're flipping a coin. Obviously, if you do need it and you have a long-term care policy, then it's going to take care of you. But if you don't need it, or if you only need it for a very short period of time, then there's an enormous opportunity cost in buying long-term care insurance coverage, although it may be suitable for some of you depending on your personal circumstances. Last but not least, you can use alternative options. One would be to use an annuity chassis that provides for a long-term care rider. So that way you can start using that annuity benefit, and if at some point in time you need additional money to cover long-term care, there are annuity riders that would actually double the income that you're generating out of these guaranteed annuities in order to offset that additional expense of long-term care. But if you don't ever need long-term care, then you continue to receive your income until the day you die, and then if there's any income left or any assets left at that point in time inside of those programs, then they would go to your surviving spouse and or other beneficiaries, as you may have named it in the contract. You can also use a life insurance chassis, which is a new thing nowadays. Most insurance companies realize that people have a need for long-term care. So in the old days, life insurance policies would only pay the death benefit if you died. But nowadays, you can have life insurance policies that have a long-term care rider. So that way, if you have a need to use the long-term care rider for long-term care needs, as long as you can qualify in not being able to perform 2 of the 6 activities of daily living, or ADLs, then you can actually, the insurance companies will allow you on these life insurance contracts to actually start to spend down your death benefit in order to cover your long-term care expenses. And then at the point that you pass away, whatever remains will then go tax-free once again to your surviving beneficiary. So with a life insurance approach or the fixed index annuity approach or chassis, someone is always going to get the benefit. So that's going to give you the leverage to be able to offset that opportunity cost that you would have lost had you decided to not to go ahead and purchase a long-term care contract. And then the fourth point that I want to talk to you, or the 4 major risks that you need to pay attention to, would be the risk of living with eroding factors. And the eroding factors would be taxes, inflation, stock market volatility, interest rate volatility, propensity to consume, maintenance and repairs because things go bad and they need to be replaced at some point in time, and then obviously product replacements like your roof may have to be replaced, automobiles, furniture may have to be replaced, ovens, microwaves, refrigerators, all of those things, and they kind of erode the value of your assets in retirement. So obviously, most of us have a clear understanding that taxes may very well double in the very near future because we have the most debt that we have ever had in the history of our country, yet we're the third lowest tax bracket in the history of our country. So the only way that we're going to be able to offset that tax train coming down the pike is by the U.S. government to being able to double the taxes at some point in time in the future. And you want to be prepared because at the end of the day, it's not how much money you make, but how much money you keep. Inflation is a silent killer. Inflation is not tax deductible, so you need to make certain that your retirement assets are staying ahead of inflation, not only for a few years, but for a period of 30 years minimum in retirement from that perspective. Stock market volatility. You still need to be able to invest for growth, but if you're investing for growth, and then obviously there's susceptibility for losses. So you need to find ways in which you can invest for growth and still have your principal protected. From that perspective. And then the same thing happens with interest rate volatility. Many other clients that I had in the 1990s were investing their retirement assets in CDs because they were paying anywhere between 5 and 6%. Have had to take a much higher risk approach or they have had to take more risk on their investable dollars in order to offset that depreciation in the value of their income due to the low interest rate environment that we're living and have been living in the United States for a long, long time. And then obviously propensity to consume. Some of you are spenders, some of you may be savers, so you need to understand how that works and how that is going to impact your retirement distribution planning throughout your retirement and golden years. What are some of the risk planning options that you should consider? Do some tax reduction shifting. There are three buckets, IRS buckets. You have the taxable bucket, the tax deferred bucket, and the tax-free bucket that we've talked in other podcasts. Well, start considering doing some tax reduction shifting by shifting more and more of your assets in this low tax rate environment from the taxable bucket and the tax deferred bucket to the tax-free bucket, because you want to move your assets from forever taxed to never taxed. So by putting more and more of your retirement assets into tax-free buckets, then obviously you're going to be able to mitigate the rising cost of additional taxes throughout your retirement life. Also, you may want to consider tax leveling. Most of the investments and most of the audits that we do for clients that are investing in traditional investments like CDs and stocks and mutual funds and so forth, they're actually allowing those investments to continue to compound. And when you compound the rate of return, you're also compounding the tax liability. But the question is, well, if you're asked from a business perspective, if you want compound interest or simple interest, most of us are going to say, well, we want compound interest because at the end of the day, it's going to increase that interest compounding effect in retirement. But if someone were to ask you, would you like to have compound tax or simple tax? All of you are going to say, no. Time out. I want compound interest, but I have simple tax. Well, you can't get both unless you do proper tax planning, because the way that most Americans are planning their retirement, they're doing it through a compounding effect of both interest and taxes alike. Also, you need to have inflation-protected assets. You need to have assets that will keep up with inflation. But by the same token, you need to have assets that will increase with inflation and will provide inflation protected returns to you and your family, but it will also guarantee and protect your principal. So now you have the ability to invest a lot more aggressively, try to maximize the good times of the market and the good times of inflation protected investments, but by the same token, you're protecting against market losses in retirement, which are so critically important when it comes to having a successful retirement life. So again, I'm hoping that most of you have enjoyed this podcast today. Again, paying attention to the 4 pillars of retirement is something that it is crucial, and it is apropos for each and every one of you to consider before you actually reach your retirement years. Always remember that my number one goal for all of you throughout each and every podcast and seminar and webcast that I do for all of you is to kind of help you and your family change the way that you see things. Because when you change the way that you see things, the things that you see change. So again, thanks once again. Feel free to reach out with any questions to area code 786-766-1042, or feel free to email me at Bert, B-E-R-T, at GablesTaxGroup.com. Again, once again, thanks for your time, and we'll talk again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.